Hello, and welcome back to Online Education Across the Atlantic. It's going to be a busy July for us with several conferences, and several of them are going to be the LMS or VLE users conferences that we go to, or we get a lot of news about them for those who are not attending the conferences. I don't want to name names. So this is, we wanted to share with our listeners and viewers what we're thinking about heading into these conferences. What's the status of the big vendors and what are we looking at? And to get started, I will point out that, the big four, the most commonly used LMS or VLEs are Moodle Worldwide, Instructure Canvas, D2L Brightspace, and Anthology Blackboard. And we're certainly going to talk about all four of those. But also point out that there's, I'm going to a conference with Open edX that's in Paris, and I'll let you guys choose my primary motivation for going to that. Moodle has their conference in September. So there's just a lot going on, and we'll cover some of these additional vendors as well. But before we get started, I guess it's probably good sort of talking about the market. With you two, is this a really boring market and nothing's going on? Or is this an unstable market and there's a lot of change in the air? Or just what's your impression of the market at large? And start with you, Morgan.
I think it's a fairly boring market. One, there are a fairly small number of vendors that are in play, for the most part. I mean, as our report shows, there's a bunch of different vendors who deal with particular kinds of things. That being said, there are some sort of big questions in terms of strategy and the way that they're dealing with things like AI and so on. So there are differences. It's not like it's just flat, but it's been a slow market in terms of changes from institutions and also just the size. So it's a fairly boring market, I would say.
Like, what do you think, since there are not many schools changing from one vendor to another, why is that?
I think partly it's a timing issue, which I think is underrated as an excuse. So, there was a lot of change in that 2014, 15, 16 kind of time frame, and schools tend to stay with a vendor for a while unless something dramatic happens. So, I think in the next couple of years, we may be looking at some shifts, especially if, some of the current dynamics continue, but partly places a lot of shifts happen. So just back in the day, I forget which year, but it was close to 2019, when I was still at Gartner, an investor sent me a list of the 100 biggest institutions in terms of enrollment in the United States and said, off the top of your head, tell me which of these have changed LMSs in the last couple of years. And I went through just with him on the call, and the vast majority of them had changed. So, one, we're just not seeing that much change. And even though it's not a commoditized market, I think there's a lot of similarity in terms of, there's not a lot of breaking out saying, hey, we're going to do something completely different. So those are two of the things that are, making it boring for me. But as I said, I like boring. Boring is good.
All right, Neil, what's your exciting answer? How do you evaluate the market overall?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with certain points that Morgan's made. I mean, I think ultimately what makes a market exciting is that sense of kind of dynamism and change and innovation and the effects of things. And I think, when you're thinking about it in terms of a market around, what are the trends in terms of institutions moving, I think there's also that kind of history aspect, isn't there, where, if you've kind of been in this space for a while, you've seen the kind of early days of LMSs and VLEs, and you've seen more dynamism because of that, and people adopting stuff for the first time. And probably there's a period where institutions were changing a bit more. But I think, whether we're talking about a kind of a general slowdown, in general, there's not a lot of, year on year, there's not a lot to talk about, certainly in my context, in terms of who's changed, who's switched. I'm seeing more kind of renewals, which isn't as an exciting a story, although it's a story, as other things. And I think the other aspect of that relates to kind of the picture of the market is also the extent to which you could have, great product updates and great enhancements and changes. But those things don't always change the dial in terms of the market, because I think some of the reasons why institutions aren't changing at the moment is not because they don't necessarily see a product that might be better on the market. It's just that they're in tough times at the moment, and therefore just actually I've seen a lot of tenders or similar type documents that have basically been, we just want to renew because we've got loads of other stuff to deal with, not so much in those words. And so that's another challenging element where, if you think of like a consumer product where suddenly, I think about like my online bank or something like that, or my finance app or something. You get a whole bunch of new features, and I think I'm going to go to them actually because that's a really cool thing, and people are talking about that bank and that product. So I think it's a slow moving market that's not super dynamic, which makes it challenging. And I think even the kind of product innovations don't always turn the dial in the way that they might do for an app, say. So I think those are aspects of it. But I think when you sort of follow the space and you get into weeds of the space and you kind of know the companies and the differences, then, all of the different things that come out, equate to areas of interest, even though in general, for those reasons, it's not the sexiest of markets.
I'm trying to picture you running a tender for your personal online bank, and
yeah,
that must be an exciting process.
Yeah.
Tracing requirements, matrices, and this is good stuff. There's no doubt that the market's not changing much, and it hasn't changed. I'm more and more viewing this as not a matter of when will it get back to the middle 2010s and have a lot of changes back and forth. There's some element of it, but I think there's another element of, is the LMS market becoming the SIS market, the Student Information System market? I mean, you can't run a university without a student information system. It's critical. It controls your registrar, your course scheduling, so much of the university is there. But it's very seldom do you change these days. I mean, it's more than 10 years. And it's certainly, I wouldn't think that it's a commodity either, because there's so many differences of the vendors. And if you describe it and it's too expensive lately for institutions to change SISs very often. And as you describe the SIS market, there's an argument to say, well, that's what the LMS market is becoming. And if that's true, so you have a market that's not changing much, yet it's even more mission critical than before, and it's not a commodity. And what I mean by it's not a commodity, it's not fungible. If you change vendors, you will have different performance, different outcomes of use. It's not just saving money going from one system to another. So if you look at those together, to me, it's sounding more and more like the SIS market, but without the money that goes into the SIS market. So I would add that as well, which sounds, I don't know how that sounds to the vendors, but I think the holistic picture is pointing that direction.
What does an exciting market look like in EdTech? What would be an example? I was sort of trying to run through my head if I could come up with an example of what an exciting market would look like, and I'm coming up a little bit blank.
Well, I would argue that the LMS market in the 2010s was exciting because that's when it was lots of market changes, but also disruption of old ideas. So going from on-premises to cloud, you get vendors, Blackboard and D2L in particular, taking way too long to acknowledge that intuitive user interface in cloud is a key. So that market was exciting. You could argue that right now it's not a market that people are purchasing per se, but certainly the ChatGPT and Google Gemini and the usage of that in the classroom, mostly even more by students than by faculty, but that one's exciting.
I think
what
as
other
well,
examples?
Well, I think as well, just grounding it back in the LMS VLE side of things, I think there's definitely been areas of much greater interest because of AI, essentially, I think. I mean, I think if you were to kind of think, what would we have talked about in the last 2 years about LMS and VLE product-wise if it wasn't for AI? Like, that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. So I think, although kind of the general market, said is slow moving, I think the AI thing has generally, has generally kind of added a bit more dynamism. And it's I think we talked in the past about how that's differentiated products a little bit more, or strategies a little bit more than in the past. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think just going back to the original question in terms of what makes something exciting, I mean, I think it can be superficial. It can just be the emergence of a product and lots of changes, and it doesn't have to be in relation to kind of positive changes or positive effects or real innovation or real solving of problems.
So the OPM market has been exciting the last few years.
Yeah, because you've had lots of turmoil. I mean, like I guess it kind of depends through which lens you look at what constitutes exciting. I suppose, but yeah.
One thing I do want to add, then I'd like to sort of talk about specific vendors. I attended a Gemini in Education, Google Gemini in Education event recently, and it was also K-12 focused. They were leading into the ISTE conference, and they were pre-announcing things to certain people. But I'm telling you, you sit there and take in all of the stuff that's happening there. It is, I think we in higher education get too tied to this cynical storyline. Oh, it's just hallucinations. Oh, it's overhyped. It's going to change everything, or it's nothing. You watch this, and the technology that they have within Gemini, particularly within Notebook LM, is stunning. I just cannot describe how it is really impressive and changing rapidly. So Notebook LM, its ability to take a lot of material and summarize it into study notes, into an audio podcast. They're rolling out soon a video summary. So they'll be doing this video podcast for us. But I think they're even doing explainer videos that can be created from course materials, and students are using this, and it really changes how you can study, and it changes a lot of assumptions behind how we do quizzing, etc. And one of the things that really hit me is, how do EdTech vendors, particularly LMS VLE vendors in this case, how do you keep up with that? It's not that we're creating our own LLMs. So the underlying technology, we already assume we're using big tech, large language models, and Gen AI. But watching this, it raises the question about products, things like Notebook LM, that are directly usable to end users. And how do LMS vendors, or should they, or can they, compete with that type of big tech investment? And that is a major question for me. And it gets back to the differing AI strategies. But I'm just saying, I think there's going to be a lot of changes of EdTech in terms of technology in the classroom. And there's an element of the LMS vendors need to scramble to maintain their relevance longer term, based on what I think that's what I'm saying right now. I have to think this through a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in terms of the level of agency that some of the AI tools give to students and learners in a way that, maybe wasn't present in the past. I mean, I guess there was always things that they could use in terms of EdTech alongside their studies, but I think the developments that we're seeing with AI really blow it open. And I think not only that, you kind of almost have that paradigm in work. I saw something recently around how many people are paying for their own individual AI, whether it's ChatGPT or whatever, and just using it within their work and circumventing anything that their company might have. There's that kind of real personal, individual agency element of it, which I think plays into the kind of study side of things. Obviously, then there's questions of, are students set up to use that effectively, and do they need guidance around that kind of thing? What does that mean for the institutional tools and the ways in which we might have been a bit more directive around what they should do, like do a quiz and read around their study? So I think that's super interesting. Does that mean that the LMS goes away? I don't think so, but I think it's a sort of a step on from, I don't know when personal learning environments were talked about, but it feels like a long time ago. But it's kind of a step on from there in terms of the agency and the power that people have to use this technology for their own learning.
I think that just jump in there. I think you mentioned the key word, and it helps me think through this. It's the directive. Institutions want to be directive. And I think that there's going to be a desire to, hey, we will set up AI access for you, and here's how you can use it, and here's what's approved. And there's always a desire to be directive. The more I'm seeing recently, that's not going to work. They need to rethink the paradigm of the institution directing how students and faculty and even staff are going to use these tools, and get a lot more into figuring it out and seeing what's happening.
Yeah, the nature of knowledge creation and manipulation and acquisition has changed.
Yeah. All right. So let's jump into individual vendors, because that is where there is some interesting news. The first, I'll get back to Open edX later in this episode, but let's start. The first conference is going to be Anthology Together, which we've already mentioned is a very unfortunate name for this time frame, because Anthology is going through debt restructuring. Blackboard is actively being shopped for sale. So they're looking at one of the ways to deal with the debt is to break up the company, which could include Blackboard being its own company again, or Blackboard being part of some other strategic company's portfolio. We don't know the answer, but given the fact that Anthology's position is together, we have a suite of tools and they all fit together, that messaging is going to be pretty tough. So I guess I'm already answering my question of what I'm looking for then. It is unknown what the status of Blackboard is as a product line, as a company. It is quite clear that in the debt ratings agencies are very clear, something has to happen. They cannot manage their debt, and their debt holders are forcing a change. And I was hoping for their own sake that there would be an answer. So you go into Anthology Together and they say, here's the answer. Here's what's going to happen to it. It's getting pretty close where it's not that we're not going to have an answer as we head in there. At the same time, they've been the most aggressive in investing in their own AI tools within the product line, typically without monetizing or charging extra, which is an expensive proposition. So I have to admit, I think that conference is going to have the biggest immediate questions to answer. What are you guys looking for, particularly for Blackboard, and what they might announce, or what I should be? So I'm the only one of the three of us who's going to that conference. What should I be looking for?
I think it's hard to get beyond that big cloud that's hanging over them. Sorry, I was just trying to think of a witty way of thinking about a change from Anthology Together to something that's more descriptive. Together for now, maybe. It's hard to get past that cloud that's looming over them, really. And I think that's the main thing that, I guess is on my radar for kind of understanding what's happening around that and what that means.
Are you hearing UK universities talk about that right now? Like, is it a topic of talk, or is it something that the analysts such as ourselves are talking about?
I think often those things rarely cut through to the universities themselves. And so I don't often hear that. And I would say that even in relation to some of the travails of OPMs as well, actually. Sometimes I've had conversations assuming that people would be aware of certain things and they're not. So I don't think that's been a big thing in the UK. And if anything, the thing that I've seen the most of in terms of institution activity has really been kind of renewals with Blackboard recently. So I think that's the big thing, because I think in the past, maybe 12 months ago, we would have been talking a bit more about kind of AI features. Maybe we'll get on this in terms of a more general point, but I feel like there's a bit more of kind of AI feature consolidation going on at the moment. And so
consolidation between vendors?
Sorry, consolidation is not the right. Consolidation in terms of consolidation of AI features. So rather than going further and progressing and developing more and more features, I think there was a flurry of activity across the different vendors in different ways, and actually just seeing things like Blackboard talking a bit more deeply about their AI conversation tool rather than the next new thing. That's what I mean, essentially. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at in terms of, I just think that's such a big potential story that it's hard to get beyond that. And I've not seen lots of stuff product wise across the piece that makes me think, oh, well, I'm looking for this or looking for that. I mean, you're always looking for impact, I suppose, around some of the things that they've done in the past and the way that they've kind of evolved the product in the past. You're kind of looking for impact. But yeah, for me, it's the kind of question mark over Blackboard that's the big thing.
Although I would say, before we go to Morgan, what you're describing and beyond the cloud of what's happening with their debt, their adoption is, I think what you're implying is, if they're consolidating on existing features, then one of the biggest questions is more and more they're going to need to show usage, that colleges and universities are using these tools in a meaningful manner. So that's something to watch for. Morgan, what are your thoughts on that?
So, one, I hope this is the last conference in a long time that you get to go to Las Vegas. I think Las Vegas needs to be done as a conference venue, just to answer a trivial question first, but an important one for me. But secondly, I want to see where they're going next with the AI. I mean, they were first out the gate. They approached it in a much more comprehensive sort of way than the other places. But are they going to kick on and go to a next thing? Because especially last week or the week before, when you were telling me about the Google meeting that you were at for the first time, I had also been at InStride Impact Conference, and Lev Gonik was one of the keynotes there. But just talking about the vision for ASU in terms of the LMS and AI there was very different from what I've heard from vendors. So I want to see if they've evolved into what we're starting to see from Google and from the ASUs of the world, or is it going to be stuck sort of tweaking some of those sort of fairly nice but fairly humdrum kinds of things that they're doing. So that would be sort of one thing. The other one is and this is a particular interest of mine, and maybe not broadly shared, but about the continuing education and non-credit market. That's one thing I'm going to be looking at extensively with Instructure and D2L. But Blackboard or Anthology actually has all the bits in place, but they just don't talk about it. And it's an opportunity that I think is lost, as it is almost as much as it is for Moodle, which also doesn't talk about it. So yeah. Those are sort of some of the things off the top of my mind.
Yeah, if I can jump in there, I think there's some really interesting points there, and I think there's some general themes there. I mean, the continuing education short course thing is really front of mind for me at the moment, and I think that's sort of what I think about in terms of new business, I suppose. In a way, we're kind of talking about the kind of core university side of things, but I kind of think about sort of themes, and it is, that is one theme in terms of kind of generating kind of new business or new activity. And I think the other element of that, which we might get into later, is how much the UK, the US are as big a deal as emerging and fast growing international markets too. But yeah, that's a slightly different point.
So here's one idea, armchair product management that we're doing. So we can say whatever we want. We don't have to develop. But from day one, when Anthology bought Blackboard, campus management was the core SIS. And I said, this just doesn't make sense. It's if you make the assumption that because a school purchases their SIS from one vendor, they'll also want to buy their LMS or vice versa. Strategy that didn't work. However, in the non-credit market, there's this opportunity, and I think we're all talking about it. They have course registration for technology. They have CRM technology to communicate with all kinds of vendors, not just matriculated student vendors, with students. You have the LMS. Why have they never just had a standalone non-credit package that just, you don't have to use the campus, what used to be called, you don't have to use Anthology Student, but this standalone mini package will get you going in non-credit in a coordinated fashion. They've never... Maybe they thought about it and they haven't done it.
Well,
But,
two years ago in an analyst meeting, I did ask about it, and they seemed surprised. Like, oh,
Okay.
yeah, no, we could do that.
So
I think that's so interesting talking about this, because in the UK I see a lot of maybe a lot is to overstate it, but I see a decent amount of activity around those types of products now. And having just done a massive piece of work looking at that across UK higher education, the infrastructure behind existing offers is, how can I be polite, is pretty desperate.
It's an area where there's a massive amount of pain on the part of customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's interesting to juxtapose with what we've been talking about AI features, because there's part of me that thinks, I'm really interested in a new innovative approach and to take things forward and to really develop the product. But also part of me thinks, well, to an extent, what's the incentive for the company? Because I think on another side of the kind of coin, if I ask myself, am I really seeing lots of innovative AI usage in higher education pedagogy? I may be missing something, but the answer to that in general is no. And therefore, if AI product features cost, what is the incentive for me as a business to go in that direction when, on the flip side, I'm seeing enough signals of institutions and problems on the non-credit side of things where there may be an opportunity? So I think that's an interesting tension that's in the market as well.
I think you're arguing that we should be making this market even more boring. Take away the one sexy aspect of AI.
Well, I know, but I think that's an interesting strategic conundrum, because we talked about the fact that, actually what AI does is it gives a lot more power and agency into hands of students who, are not necessarily looking for institutions to supply tools that they can use. The need might be, and I'm speculating a little bit more, the capability to kind of think about how they use those tools in study in a way that's productive. So actually, if I'm running an LMS company, I think it's perfectly reasonable to think about a strategy that is, maybe more conservative around that front. I'm not saying that that's what they should do or that's what I would do, but I think that's a reasonable discussion to have given where we're at.
LMS companies need to repress their inner squirrel, because the squirrel in them comes out too often. The dog chasing the squirrel. It's like AI.
But aren't they partially doing that because their customers are talking about squirrels, even if they're not, or they're talking about acorns, even if they're not using acorns? Isn't that part of the issue as well?
I think it is, but they need to really work with their customers to explain that, hey, we got to solve these other problems, and really work with them around that rather than pandering to it. And in the early days of Instructure, we used to see them doing that. It's like, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to solve this problem. And so it can work, I think.
I think it also is interesting around perception, because I think we talked about this when we spoke about AI in the past. But for me, innovation isn't creating a new AI feature that no one uses and has no impact. Innovation for me is a lot more using AI to solve a reoccurring or common problem in a way that just reduces loads of friction and actually makes people think, great, this is really actually useful. And I think just going back to what we were talking about earlier, the ways in which the new banking apps have done that, I think has been an example of a product in like another realm that actually I can think of a few products that make me think, this is actually really good now. This has actually really solved the problem, or it makes my life a bit easier. And so I think it also depends how you gauge and think about innovation.
So this gets back to the sexy spreadsheet usage that I mentioned, Morgan. That saved me so many hours with a 1-sentence prompt, and it still is stunning to me how useful that was.
Can I just say that's probably the first usage of those two words together?
Sexy spreadsheet.
Yeah, that might be true.
I did actually manage to find a product where you can buy spreadsheets, so bed sheets that look like spreadsheets, and I threatened to buy Phil that for his birthday. But then he pointed out that those were Google spreadsheets and he prefers Excel. Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about other vendors. Then the following week is both D2L Fusion, and which is in Savannah, Georgia. Morgan's going, and then InstructureCon, which is in Spokane, Washington, that I'm going to. So let's start with D2L Fusion. And I will point out, so I went to that last year. This year, Morgan's going to it. Last year, it was dominated by D2L saying, we're differentiating based on interactive content development. Increasing with the H5P acquisition and their own Creator Plus, how do we offer more for people to not just create content, but interactive content within the LMS? That was what dominated last year. And AI was within that context. How does it help get that done? And a few other things. So it's quite different than Anthology. This year, I'm not quite sure if you have a good preview of what it's going to be like. But so Morgan, what are you going to be looking for at the conference beyond some excellent haunted seafood joints while you're in Savannah?
I'm going to be staying inside. That's what I'm going to be doing, having had a taste of southern summer recently in Atlanta. So I'm going to be staying inside in the probably pretty good air conditioning. So that's what I'm going to be doing. But I think following on of their non-credit move, because they have purchased a company that they're doing there, but I want to see what the progress is. I think also it relates to that approach about content and things like that, but gets to some larger things that I'm looking at is pricing strategy and the way that they're sort of thinking about that and how that's going to work. Because I think LMSs are traditionally underpriced, so places are looking at the add-ons and things like that, which traditionally doesn't go down well with clients. So what is that sort of tension there? So that's another thing that I'm going to be looking at. I'm also, this is just a small thing, but I'm going to be looking for clients from Canada who aren't yet clients of D2L to see what's going on, because there's some pressure in Canada, particularly Ontario, to move to D2L, and in terms of the trade troubles. So those are some of the things I'm going to be looking at. But again, to see how far that content strategy has evolved, because it's all very well to announce it, but it's really the evolution that's really important to me. Can you move on from that initial announcement?
So this is risky, but you're breezing past two points that I think we've written about, but I think we need to highlight because they're significant. One is you talked about it, LMS is underpriced. So Morgan, once again, saying colleges and universities, you are not paying enough for your LMS or VLE. The second thing you mentioned was the very pithy phrase, the trade troubles. And so describe both of those a little bit more.
And you mentioned risky, and a few years back, I said this exact thing to the CEO of one of the LMS companies, and actually a very calm man normally, but I thought he was going to punch me. He almost climbed over the table. He didn't like that. But if you look at the pricing for LMSs, it's remained flat for a very long time, even if they have added extra features and put a lot of investment into things like AI and making the user interface thing. So I think it's underpriced relative to the importance on the campus and to what it's doing as well. The trade troubles. I'm borrowing a page from Neil's countryman who talked about the troubles, So it's not quite as bad as that, but the tariff wars between the United States and everybody, including islands of penguins, who fortunately don't have LMS companies. But I'm hearing from some Canadian clients that there is some pressure to start to think about moving away from an Instructure or a Blackboard, in part to limit their vulnerability to some of this tariff concern, even though in the past these kinds of services have not been subject to tariffs. Am I right in that, Phil?
Yeah, I think that's right. I would liken it to in the mid to late 2010s. I got the same feeling in Europe, although it started out as sort of the dominant feeling of because of the NSA and the data privacy issues. And there was a heavy bias against U.S. companies because of, well, how do we know that your data isn't going to be going to the U.S. and then you have no idea where it's going? And I think the AWS Center in Frankfurt really helped solve that bias. But I liken that what you're saying is there's an emerging bias from Canadian institutions to not go American. That's what I'm hearing from you.
So I'll be walking around saying, "Hey, anybody want to watch some hockey?"
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm not sure you should do that.
Yeah, to see if anybody comes and chats with me. But
I think
I can't tell if that's a South African or Canadian accent, but
I'm not good at accents. It's bad enough having my own one. Although I sometimes joke that if I'd known that having an accent was going to be such a big hit, I would have gotten one earlier. But
So Neil, tell us about D2L in your mind and what questions you have.
I'm fascinated because I'd never expected the LMS to be part of a kind of a buy local, buy regional kind of movement, but maybe that's going to be the Canadian campaign for D2L. I should watch that with interest.
LMS to table movement.
Yes. Yeah. I think the strategic point that Morgan made around the kind of add-on strategy, I think, is front of mind for me, just because I remember when I was in Amsterdam for the D2L conference, the European conference, I think one of the things that struck me in one of the sessions, and I forget which add-on it was now, so forgive me, but the show of hands for people who'd actually adopted it was not what you would have hoped it to be in a session like that. And so, when you're sort of executing on that strategy and you're developing those kind of add-ons, I mean, you want to see impact, but ultimately you also want to see and prove that kind of strategy, really. So I'm not sure that this would necessarily come to light at a conference, but it's certainly not through the main sessions, but it's kind of gauging the extent to which actually people are adopting these things that are kind of new and developing, such that you can get a sense of actually, how that strategy is performing. Because we kind of questioned it in the past around, institutional finances and whether these things would come under review when institutions are thinking about a VLE change. So that's a big one for me. I've seen bits and bobs around Lumi, so I'm kind of interested in seeing how that's progressing and just for people, Lumi is their branding of the AI tools within D2L Brightspace. Yeah. So I'm interested in how big that becomes. I'm interested in whether that continues to be this thing, or whether it just gets kind of I guess sort of it just blends into the product, if I can put it like that, because I think that's another element of like how you think about AI in relation to a product too. So those are the big things for me for D2L. Or maybe one other thing, if I can just add it, I'm just interested also in terms of focus, because I think, to my earlier point, when I sort of survey the scene in maybe the last 6 months for some of these companies in the UK, I see a lot of stuff around kind of international movements and adoptions and things like DTL have been really pushing around kind of that presence in Ireland. And so, yeah, it's sort of what's coming out in terms of market focus and whether that tells you anything.
So one thing about D2L, I mean, they have, clearly they, along with Instructure Canvas, have been the winners in terms of new implementations, but we've already described there aren't that many opportunities anymore. And we're not sure when that's going to increase. But they've also, going to your point, they've invested in a lot of features. They've always had a lot of features, particularly compared to Canvas. But with the Lumi, the Creator Plus, the H5P acquisition, they have even more. So part of it is how much do they, or how well is that leveraging of depth of features impacting what people are talking about. So I'd love to hear from you, Morgan, about what people talking about. Oh, this feature in Creator Plus, this feature over here, or as Neil's, talking about, even if you can get the whole raise of hands, who's using Creator Plus and paying for it to make yourself popular. I would add one other thing, Stephen Laster leaving and going to Panopto. He was president and COO. John Baker, founder, CEO, is jumping back into that more of that operational role. But that raises a question, are we sort of pulling the company backwards in time? Not necessarily backwards in functionality, but what is the management change, particularly with Stephen leaving? What does that mean? And does that change the direction of where they're going? John's is by far the remaining
Survivor.
founder CEO who's there, right?
Yeah.
So how much does that longevity, and it's not all private equity and stuff like that, how does that play from a management perspective is another big question, even more than last year, from what I saw. So going back to that pricing, I think that we talked about the stability of pricing, which is not necessarily good, but because the LMS market is underpriced, that's what so often forces companies to go into corporate markets or do other things just to justify themselves to investors, which isn't necessarily good with colleges and their core audience. So part of the reason I think it's underpriced is because if these systems were priced higher, I think we'd get more focus from the companies of truly supporting what colleges and universities need. But direct your ire at Morgan for that point.
And just in from 2014 to 2024, 2022, I just did a lot of contract reviews with institutions, and especially in the earlier part of that period, the mid-teens, there was a lot of, particularly of Blackboard, of just add-ons and things like that. And I think places, really underestimate how much that annoys higher ed. It just drives them crazy. So that when Instructure came with very simple contracts, just one price, pretty much that included everything that they needed, they jumped to that just because they like that simplicity in a way. Sure, there were other things going on, but that was a big part of it.
Yeah, true. All right, so let's move on to InstructureCon. So I'll be going to Spokane, Washington. Yeah, Spokane and Savannah, not easy places to get to. I know you criticize Las Vegas, but at least Vegas is easy to travel to. And I listened to you. You said there's an excellent restaurant at the Fontainebleau. So Emily is coming out with me, I think, just for the spa and just so we can find the restaurant that you were telling me I have to go to. So there are important things to solve. InstructureCon. So this is going to be a very interesting time for them, partially to see how their taking advantage of other opportunities, particularly the Anthology. And let's build on the pricing. For the first time, Anthology, Instructure's always been very solid and disciplined with their pricing. I think they're trying to be very aggressive in taking advantage of the cloud over Blackboard because of the debt structure. Excuse me. So that's one of the things I'll be looking for. The other one, and I'll go back to this Gemini for Education. I've been critical of Instructure that their product group is just not putting out very much. If they reintroduce Conmigo for a third time at this InstructureCon, I'm gonna, that will be a standalone post criticizing. You can't keep doing that. You need your own product strategy. And I just don't see much. Having said that, and having, the topic we had about AI, there is an argument saying Neil, you even mentioned, what's the incentive for developing AI when it's not really being used for pedagogical advancements at universities? There can be an argument for the Canvas strategy of saying, no, we're not putting much into new features because we just want to integrate. Maybe it's not Conmigo, but the Gemini for Education also announced that you can now access those tools directly within Canvas. So Notebook LM, they're going to make it easier to access Notebook LM. So there's a strong, and I think PowerSchool was the other version, obviously Google Classroom. But so there's an argument to say, hey, we shouldn't be doing too much product. We should just be getting these other tools in there. There's another piece, which is, I can't talk too much detail, but I mean, we are hearing whispers that there might be some meaningful product announcements, more so than the past 2 years of InstructureCon. So when I go there, I'm going to be seeing, what is their product strategy? And is it a coherent story, particularly vis-a-vis Gen AI and big tech? And are they going to be announcing product advancements specifically in Canvas that gets their customers to do what they used to do, where people in the audience, where they hear it, they're like, oh, thank you. We've been waiting for that so much. So I'm really looking for that and just sort of the general mood, because Instructure's executive team, right now you have about 3 people who are remaining, maybe 4 if you include, some of the back office people who remain from an education, EdTech background or from a long time InstructureCon. They have a lot of new executives who come from completely outside of education. You're not seeing them talk. So I have a question. How well do they know the market? The new chief revenue officer, how well does that person understand what the real pain points of higher ed is and how colleges and universities think? So there's a risk they're becoming too corporate, too private equity based, or maybe they're just going to keep running, operating extremely well. So I'll be looking at their management situation as well. So having said all that, what are your big observations and questions on Instructure that I should be looking for, or the questions that you have that you hope that come out in the July timeframe?
I can jump in. I've got 2 sort of additional ones to all the ones that you're looking at. The one is, what is their strategy, RE, Parchment in specific, and the whole workforce thing. I've heard rumors that Headlamp didn't work, that it's not going on there. So I've never heard a coherent approach to what they're doing there, and I really want to figure out.
Could you describe Headlamp, what you mean by that?
I don't know a lot about it. I've just heard, but it was a way of helping to prepare students and connect them with employers as well. If you've got a more pithy one, that would be great. But so I want a better approach to what they're doing there, what their long-term plan is. It seems there's a lot of spaghetti being thrown at the wall, or this is going to help us some way. And I think there's a real risk of it running into some real problems or not sort of having the features that can keep clients there. So that would be the other thing. And then again, it's the non-credit stuff. Last year at InstructureCon, I made the point of going to a lot of the non-credit presentations, and it felt like a bit like schools were saying, yeah, catalog is working for us, but so long as I stand on one leg and recite Wordsworth backwards 7 times and twist the light bulb, that's when it works, to do this particular very common task that I need to do. So I want to see if they're investing in that and what the product line looks like, because again, it sort of seems like they have ideas. A lot of LMS strategy feels a bit like my blogging pipeline. I've got a lot of great ideas, but then following it through with an actual post sometimes takes a lot more work, and they're not doing that work to get it to that thing. So those would be my 2 big ones.
You have a new newsletter that you're committing to by
I am. In fact, I have
Friday.
posts. And I needed to talk to you about helping me set up the thing. And I feel guilty because you just had a daughter get married and a kid and a new grandchild, and I actually am ready to do it, but I need your help.
Oh, the day before I hop on a plane.
Yes, that's why I said I'm feeling guilty. I don't want to do it, so maybe we need to wait until...
No. All right, Neil?
I was just going to say, I feel seen in what you were saying around blog posts and ideas and those coming to fruition. If anyone went through my notes, then they'd be they'd confirm that. I think for me, I've liked some of the AI features that they've developed, things like the kind of intelligent insights and translation and things like that. I suppose, and this is probably my bad, but the extent to which some of those things are actually rolled out more widely would be interesting to understand, and maybe that's in the public domain and it's my bad. But I think it's just interesting. I was thinking about this as you guys were speaking, that do we really get a sense that we could put a label on their AI product strategy in the way that we might do some of the other vendors? And maybe that's fine, but I think it's just the absence of understanding what the strategy is, or to be able to glean the strategy. If it is that kind of, we're not going to make this a big thing in of itself, we're going to make adjustments to the product, and that's our strategy, and then we might kind of bring in other EdTech like Khan Migo.
By the way, let me put a phrase on it. What we're looking for, because I think all 3 of us are describing in different ways, we're looking to see if there's any coherence in their product strategy, not just individual good ideas. Is there any coherence? That's what the non-sexy label I would add.
No, that's a great way of putting it. I mean, I think the other thing for me is I suppose I've kind of maybe said in the past, I feel like they talk about, I think more so than the other companies, they talk a bit more about higher education trends, some micro credentials and things like that. And I think I'm interested to get a sense of how that translates into strategy and prioritization around some of the things that Morgan talked around about catalog, because I know that they are sort of invested in those developments in the UK, like the lifelong learning entitlement and that kind of shorter provision. I know that they're engaged in that side of things, but the extent to which I've seen that translated in terms of product, and then maybe being a bit more a bit kind of louder around things like catalog. I think that's what I'm interested to see. I mean, in the UK, I would say, they've really built a very strong position, I think, around Canvas over here. And so it's, maybe there is a bit more rope to prioritize other products and align with other challenges that institutions have. But I guess I'm not seeing that directly. And that'll be interesting to see and observe. I mean, I think on Morgan's point around Parchment feels like less aligned with the UK space, but Catalog is the one, I suppose, that my eyes are kind of more fixed on.
Yeah, I am too. I realize that Parchment's more important. Morgan knows that market better than I do. But yeah, I'm looking for coherence, a story to make it understandable across all of those product lines. On the positive side, I was thinking another way to describe this. Of all of the vendors, Instructure has the best finances. They're the strongest in terms of money. Not they spend a lot of time offshoring development to Hungary, a lot of layoffs. They've been better on the management side, and now they have KKR behind them as private equity. They have the greatest financial resources. Are they, does that come out in their strategy as far as what they can do? So that leads to the other big one, obviously, is Moodle. Moodle's the biggest worldwide. They've changed. Martin Dugiamas has stepped down. He's still chairman of the board, but he's no longer CEO. Scott Annenberg is. Actually, there are two conferences of interest. While the three of us are at Leeds, I'm moderating a panel where I have people from Blackboard, D2L, Instructure, and Canvas all on one panel. It's a panel, so I don't know how deep we can get in the conversation, but I'm looking to hear Scott come out or say more of what his vision is or how things might change, if they're going to change at all, at Moodle. Because I know when you went to that last fall, Morgan, you didn't see much change. You saw a desire to not change is what I think you saw.
It seemed to be mostly about comforting people that things were going to stay the same. And, there was obviously some changes, real changes in product, particularly in the corporate product. A new discipline in terms of new features and things like that from Maria Schur and things like that. So there were some really positive things there, but in terms of the overall strategy, it's all good. We love education, we love nonprofit, we love the whole feel good kind of open source story. And about comforting people rather than, hey, this is going to be different because it's a different world we're living in. We need to do it. So it'll be interesting to see a year later.
Yeah, so there are two things. One is a desire to change, particularly in academic markets, or not to change, what you were seeing last year. But the other one, as long as we're playing armchair product management here on this podcast, why can they not do a Moodle for workplace, but do that for academia? They've shown that they have the ability to develop some pretty cool packaging of the product based on the open source core that's compelling. Yet they have so far refused to do that in academic markets, when I think that's exactly what the academic markets want to see from them. Why can they not do that? That's my armchair product management still. Why won't they do it? There's a big opportunity for them to start gaining market share again and relevance.
I want to have some t-shirts made and for me to walk around a large LMS conference with a Free Marie t-shirt on.
Oh, I like that, but I think there are probably a dozen people who get your joke there.
Yeah, well, that's true of most of my jokes, to be true.
Okay, that's a feature, not a bug. Neil, what are you looking for or thinking about in terms of Moodle?
Yeah, I mean, I think those bigger changes that you alluded to, because I think when you get someone that's coming new to a company like that, that's had the same guy running it for a long time, I think, irrespective of what the right strategy might be for them generally, I think it's quite hard for someone to come into a company like that and suddenly tear it all up. You don't want to be Morgan probably knows what I'm talking about, or what I'm about to talk about, but you probably don't. But you don't want to be kind of Brian Clough going into Leeds United. You basically want to, you kind of want to get people on side. That's one for you to Google later, Phil.
Okay.
There is a film. There is a film, but
and it's spelled Clough.
Yeah. And so
I appreciate the help.
So I think it's probably fairly reasonable to say that in the kind of initial stages of the kind of leadership transition that you're probably not going to see anything radical. But I think it's now, okay, well, having had time with a new leadership structure, whether we're actually seeing, a kind of a step the next step and what that would look like. I think what you were saying, Phil, around higher education is interesting, because I just think looking at Moodle from the outside, I think sometimes it can be difficult to ascertain what's your message to higher education, a little bit, if I can put it in those terms. And so, yeah, it'd be good to hear something that's a bit more directly addressing what they're doing in higher education, what their strategy is, how they're positioning, and what they think that sector needs and wants, and how that relates to their product and how they're going to go about it. So, yeah, I think it's kind of, what's really this next kind of era of Moodle going to look like now that the dust has settled on that kind of change, and something more specific to come out of it in relation to higher education and universities.
Yep. And I'll add to it. I'm sensing I can't just conversations here and there, connecting dots. This is not something I have a formal analysis. I think there's pressure from the French family investment firm saying that I think they might be asking the same questions. Okay, we want more than this. We don't want to, I think the pandering they need to pander more to what higher education needs and less pandering to the open source developers who are doing niche products here and there who might be employed by colleges and universities. I think that's where I'm hoping they change, is to focus. So when I hear you say focus more on the needs of higher education, it's okay. It's great that we have these developers and keep them happy, but start paying attention to the bigger problems you need to solve.
Do they have an advisory board that is not the Moodle community of developers?
That's a great question, and not that I'm aware of. I am not aware of that. So, hey, that's a question I'm going to ask Scott at the Leeds conference. So let's hope he's not listening to this, or maybe he is, and then he'll have an answer.
I'm going to be going in disguise.
Yeah. Okay.
To Leeds.
Oh, good point. Good point. Okay, well, let's pick up just other vendors other than the big four. I mentioned I'm going to Open edX. The thing I'm looking for, besides smoking cigarettes and eating baguettes and some excellent food while I'm there, is the question of it's the same question as what Moodle is becoming. You keep announcing, like McDonald's, billions and billions served and like ridiculously large numbers of learners that they claim. But the question is, how relevant is it for higher education institutions and the problems they're trying to address? I've mostly viewed it as that's not their game. They don't care as much, but the whole Western governors and competency-based education, and I wrote about this, it seems like they're actually paying more to what do institutions want to do. So WGU is migrating to Open edX as their primary LMS. How many other schools are thinking of doing the same thing? Or is that a one-off and this remains, a hodgepodge, racking up numbers that make people happy with the numbers of learners served, but not directly addressing higher education pain points per se? Getting a lot of signals they do care, but that's the biggest thing I'm looking for with Open edX. I'm not sure who else I would add to that list right now where I have big questions of what's happening from a vendor standpoint. Unless we go to Germany and meet with some of the legacy open source solutions in Germany. But any others that you guys would add, or Open edX questions?
It is interesting to me that we're not talking about Microsoft here, and maybe there's an element of bitterness here from all the times I got lectured by people about, you're ignoring Microsoft's major move into the LMS space and you'll regret that, and literally with fingers pointed at me sometimes. So it is weird that we're not talking about that.
Duly noted, but nothing to add to that.
Was that? Yeah, it was a Microsoft "I told you so." I think there is potential for interest around the adoption of something different based on a different delivery model or a different type of course. And we talked about the kind of non-credit bearing continuing education side of things. I think it just depends the extent to which there's a real sort of prioritization on those moves and a kind of need. So I don't know. I tend to think of other products in relation to if an institution moves to a competency-based model or if an institution moves to develop short courses. And I think the competency side of things, I think we're seeing tiny little things, and I think there'll be something interesting at leads that'll be kind of announced on that front, or kind of trailed on that front. But I think the opportunity is if there's real friction with existing products around moves into new markets and new forms of delivery, and so, but it's whether those companies are switched on enough to kind of to focus on that side of things. So I don't know, that's probably doesn't directly address the kind of Open edX question, but I think that's just probably the opportunity space for anything new.
I think it does, because it's getting into specialty department or program specific usage and not institution-wide usage, and maybe that's where the innovation is. And that actually brings up the real vendor that we should be surprised we haven't even mentioned is Sakai. It's open source solution, but that used to be such the rage. And
also, didn't you just give a keynote there or something at their conference?
That was the Apereo, the base foundation. We didn't really talk about Sakai that much, but so not hearing much them. They're a little bit like Spinal Tap. Okay, we lost Duke. Don't worry. They're not much of a university there. Our audience is becoming more selective in just parts of Spain. But they're decreased relevance, but they've made some moves to say, well, what if we become more of a specialty program specific, pedagogy specific system that fits with your institution LMS? I don't know how much they're wholesale adopting that, but I did at least want to bring up Sakai in that question. I do think it's relevant.
Yeah, I would like us to have a whole session, if you guys think it's not too boring, for us to debate whether having a disciplinary specific LMS makes sense. I do not, but I'd love to have a debate with you guys, especially if you disagree.
No, I think it's an interesting area because there's lots of precedent of a different VLE for online degree programs. Will there be examples of that for the non-credit bearing? And then what's the best pathway through that? I think is an interesting discussion to have.
Our listeners will be clamoring for that. But actually, I do think it's a good question. It has been a question in the past, and
you get it on at institutions. It's like, oh, we need to use this because it's at Illinois it was we need to use long kappa because it was designed for chemistry.
Yeah. All right, then we'll put that in the queue of our highly detailed planning for the episodes.
But is that just going to be a VLE features thing, or is it actually going to come to fruition? We'll see.
Yeah.
Well, I think it raises bigger questions about governance and choices and how you manage EdTech. So we can, I'm trying to sell this thing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Hey, well, this is our what's most important. This is our longest episode, so that's got to be worth something. But this has been very useful. I actually think I'm thinking about I want to break this up into pieces and sharing it. Some of these individual discussions, specifically on Anthology and on the different vendors, be nice to have those out in the public before we go to those conferences. But this has been great. Appreciate this different approach that we're trying to do, and look forward to seeing you, all three of us, in person in less than 2 weeks. So thanks.